Okay, well, welcome to chapters 25 through 29, and I hope you are able to enjoy something in them or be bothered by something in them. Either way, it's always okay if we go backward, and I do want to suggest to you, if you're reading along with Luke, originally when I wrote the book, there were like 98 chapters because it covered every story in Luke. But the publisher said that's too many, so cut some out. So they didn't give me any guidance at all, just do that. So I did cut some out, and maybe I cut out sections that you're interested in. I don't know the answer to that. But let me open the floor and see if you've got any questions or comments, or like that was neat or I hate that about these chapters.
I always like hearing about the chaos with Jesus in the boat, and how that's so linked to the Leviathan and the behemoth in Psalms, and how we really need to pay attention to that part of the Bible to just kind of get a good structure in our mind of what people thought back then.
Thank you. And does it resonate with you, Rhonda, at all?
Oh yeah, it just like opens up the story so hugely, for me, and gives me much more of a solid background as to all the things that in the Bible that refer back to these ancient beliefs that we don't really pay too much attention to anymore.
Yeah, actually, we talked a little bit about this last week too. Julia asked this question. It was related to baptism, about like, what does it mean for water to be chaotic, right? And I hope it makes sense that it like sort of it's showing up over and over again. Like, again, who can calm the chaos? Like, oh, well, only God can do that. Which is why it's like a big miracle. I mean, sometimes we look at it and we're like, yeah, okay, like that's cool. In Houston, we could use somebody to calm a hurricane, but it represents more than the weather pattern, right? It represents this like primordial state of being. And wish I had that power. I do, yeah.
It's a good reminder for me that I can't fix everything. And the fixer in me needs to remember that just to be present in the storm, be present in the chaos, and just look for signs that there is some inner peace that could come from God if I'll let it, if I'll be open to it. Yeah. I tend to see a crisis and run right into it, and then realize I need to just be still.
That stillness is really hard, because I think my brain always tells me like, no, there's problems. The way to do is to struggle through those problems. And that's probably true sometimes, right? Seems like it has to be true sometimes, but I'm not always sure I get right when to do what. Marcus Borg talks about in one of his last books, I'm trying to remember when it is, he talks about the difference, and I think I mentioned it too, although I'm not sure I gave him proper credit, the difference between like struggling to tread water and like kind of leaning back and floating as kind of like ways of being spiritually. And I'm a struggler.
That also reminds me of the Tibetan Buddhist and the mindfulness and the intentions of like every moment, and like yoga, just pay attention to your breathing and deal with right now.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting too, I mean, I have a couple thoughts, but that idea with what the Buddhist was talking about and mindfulness, and like how sometimes we think we just are supposed to stop the thoughts, or stop the chaos, and like work, that's the ultimate thing, is to just, but in reality, just realizing that is the nature of the human mind, and like the nature of the world. There's this amount of chaos there, and I think I think when we try to practice that mindfulness or being present, it's not necessarily trying to stop all of that from happening, but just having more of an awareness. I don't know. I mean, they always talk about like the practice is like is coming back to, once your thoughts go off, coming back to the breath or something like that. But I don't know. Now I'm seeing attention that I didn't see initially when I started talking. but yeah, I don't know. I thought that was kind of interesting. And then the other thing I thought in the book, in your book, was like, you say God is not afraid of apparent chaos like we are. And the difference is that God knows where this is all going, and you mentioned like, if you could ensure outcome X, then, you could do Y every day. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's really, yeah, I totally see that. Like if I just knew, I knew what the outcome was going to be, like, okay, then I know it's worthwhile for me to put effort into this, but there's really no guarantee like that. We just don't know.
I think a lot of, and this is, I appreciate that because, and I struggle to live into this, but I'm cognitively like positive that the book of Revelation is written to tell you it is going to happen. Like it's going to work. It may not seem like if you read that book, which is like one of the most mistreated books in the Bible, it sort of says, it looks like hell in a handbasket, but that's not where this is headed. Like God's got you, And so like the question is, can we live life backward with that like reassurance that this is in fact going somewhere, and that even though I may not see the outcome, the inputs of like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control, those are like eternal inputs. Like they always are changing the world, even if I can't see it. I do struggle with that though, because like I'd like to see other outcomes and I'd like to see them quickly. And that's an interesting thing. And the other thing you said that I think is that I love, like having grown up with a type A, and I don't know if I am ADHD or not. I don't know. I don't know if that's helpful, but like I've grown up in church hearing like, oh, be still, and stillness is the best way of Christian spirituality. And that was so burdensome for me because like it's not natural for me. And it occurred to me like, that's probably good for some people, but to prescribe that that's the best form of spirituality is really, really weird. So to hear that meditation is not necessarily nothing, but in this language, like meditation is when we see chaos and join God and pulling order out of it. Well, that appeals to me anyway, because like I'm much better suited at thinking that way. And it gives me an option. Like I don't have to think of nothing. The way one of my teachers in seminary put it is, look, it's okay to be preoccupied. We're all preoccupied. As long as we're preoccupied with the same stuff God's preoccupied with, it's all right. I just found that so like relieving, because how am I going to not be preoccupied with stuff? Like I meet these people who are like, I'll say, what are you thinking about? And they'll say nothing. Now I say nothing sometimes, and what I mean is nothing I care to share with you. But apparently there are people who think literally about nothing. And I can't even imagine that. Because if I wanted to think about nothing, what would happen in my head is nothing, 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 thinking about nothing, thinking about, oh, there's a thing, don't think about that thing. That's what nothing thinking would look like for me. It just doesn't work. So I think it works for some people and not for everybody. And that's where I was delighted with you, Joya, to hear like, hey, there's options in like how meditation can look. It's not a one size fits all, because like we're not all the same. And that's fine.
I read a book once, Mike, that split up your Myers-Briggs personality type with good ways to pray. Oh. And you and I share a personality type, and ours was like study. And it's like that really resonated with me. The way to do it was to study and learn.
Thank you. And that, we don't have
some people it was doing stuff. It was other personality types. It was like going out and doing something was a good way of praying, according to the book.
Yeah, actually, if you know, like like in the Hindu culture and religion, there's like different kinds of yoga, and normally you think like, oh, yoga, that's like where you stretch and stuff, but like yoga is a spiritual practice, right? And there's a kind called jnana yoga, which is like study of scripture, and there's like bhakti yoga, which is like acts of loving kindness, and then there's like the kind of yoga we think of as yoga, which is really about like centeredness and like staying in your breath in these weird poses and postures, because if you practice it, you could probably do it when you leave. Like the goal is like it practices you to stay centered like all day. So there's different kinds of doing that, and that's really ancient. And beyond the Myers-Briggs, some of us did this work with the Enneagram, and a friend of mine gave me a book called Spiritual Direction for Enneagram Types, right? And it's interesting because like wherever you put yourself on the Enneagram, it suggests to spiritual directors like, hey, you might offer direction differently according to who's sitting in the room with you, right? And like there's some people who integrate everything, like all they do is try to integrate everything. And there's other people who like have these compartments. And it was like a fascinating book to hear the recognition of individuality and the opportunities of that, right? So like we all probably do respond to what we perceive as chaotic differently. That was a gift, it was a real gift for me.
Yeah, I also, when I was younger, studied a Japanese martial art that was tied to Zen Buddhism. And they taught us that when you were sitting and meditating, that it was like having pulpy apple juice. And as you sat, kind of the pulp would slowly filter out. And my teacher used to say that her teacher would sit for 30 minutes a day, unless things were really bad. And then she'd sit for an hour because it took that long for the pulp to settle and I guess get order out of chaos.
That feels like really anxiety provoking for me to just think about sitting there for an hour and doing nothing. Like,
yeah,
I don't know if I could do it. Like even if I'm like meditating, I could sit there for an hour and meditate because I'm doing something, but to just sit there, which I guess you could say is a form of meditation, but like, I don't know if I could do it.
And the good news is you don't have to. I mean, like that's where I was really helpful when I got this. There's a guy in the Great Courses who does Introduction to Meditation, and he talks about like there's the body scan, which like Julie and I have talked about this. Like if I do the body scan, I'm probably falling asleep, because like I'm not moving. But then there's like walking meditations, and like that appeals to me. And it's funny, like sometimes you hear the rules are like contain the monkey mind, but like one way I enjoy meditating is just letting my head go wild while I move, like no restrictions. You just go for it, because it's like, then later I can say, look, you've done that. So now I need you to focus.
One thing he was saying about the meditation made me think it can be like doing a rosary. Maybe you said that or he said that, but not get everything out of your mind, but kind of just focus your mind on doing godly things, or how can I self-improve, or how can I do something better next time, or just some just little thought processes that help your life or something.
Yeah, I think sometimes too, and I hope this isn't too controversial to say, like we in the church also have done this weird thing where we have like one understanding of what prayer is. So prayer is like talking to God, or it's like where you go through your laundry list about what you're worried about, and you say like, God, do that if you want to. like it's this sort of interesting thing where we're really like, I think there's a whole lot of awareness that like sometimes we act out prayer, and sometimes prayer is a like reimagining, like what is our, like, who is God calling us to be? I really appreciated this thing that happened at the forum this week, where he talked about showing devotion before the Buddha is not bowing down before some other entity, but like who you want to grow into. And it made me think like, oh, that's what icons are for. Icons are not like, you're not worshiping an image. The image is trying to guide you into like a way of living, you know? And it made me think like, sometimes we look at Jesus, and I hope this doesn't rub you the wrong way. It's like, oh, historical figure did that. Thanks for doing that. Instead of like, how do I grow into that? Like, how do I grow into being like God's beloved child and like knowing that? That seems where the two can really cross over, right? And like, there's this weird line in from one of the defenders of the Nicene Creed. Maybe you've heard it before. God became a human so that humans could become God. And it's this word apotheosis in Greek. And like sometimes, like I think what Athanasius was trying to say, right, is like, Jesus isn't a one-off, he's an invitation to be that, to be God's beloved child, which is like achievable. And it doesn't come by accruing merit, actually. It comes by like accepting that gift, enjoying the gift. That's what I should say. Like, and I think this is where you talk about eschatology. Like, hey, if you can't do it in your life, don't worry, God will help you do it later. You know, but why wait? Because that seems like that'd be a good way to live. Can I ask you about the pigs chapter? I just wonder if when I read it again, I was like, it's interesting to me how often that we like look back and we're like, oh, those silly people and their categories of uncleanliness, you know, and it's sort of like, wow, like we just so have trouble identifying that tendency in ourselves, you know, like, it's just really on my mind because if you've been following on Facebook, one of our friends, Johnny Ward, his battery went down on his anklet because he was on like house arrest, also known as probation. And they issued a warrant for his arrest because the battery went out. And he got super freaked out because like, that means you go back to jail. And going to jail is really not a positive experience for him, like really traumatic. Like I think it is for everybody. So it's just so interesting to listen to him talk about how people with prison records get treated, which is like not good. Like we'll say like, hey, you served your time and we're never going to hire you because you're a risk. Like there's no like how do you move forward from that mark? And you know, like I know for me, like if somebody's got criminal record, I mean, I could pretend like it wouldn't influence my perception, but I automatically jump to assumptions about how that's going to work out in the future.
I mean, I think that's natural though, you know, and I think when there's like you could see that as a betrayal of trust, right? You know, that this person did something that apparently they did something or they were convicted of something that, you know, is not acceptable for society, right? And so there's that betrayal of trust. And until that trust is regained, I don't think you can have reconciliation, right?
And then the question is, what mechanisms do we put in place so that it can actually happen, right? Like, do we? But I know, I mean, because even you do your probation and you've got a criminal record, so I'm not going to hire you. Mm-hmm. Like, how do you remove that like permanent mark that we put on somebody that calls them unclean? And I think a prison sentence is like modern uncleanliness. Because how do you get that off? And it's weird when you think about like that we understand that addiction is like not good, but we have socially acceptable addictions like workaholism. That's acceptable. But if you've got a narcotics problem, forget you. Even though they like come from the same source issue, right? And they reflect a wiring of the brain. One we decided is productive and the other is like not good. And look, I get it. There's different consequences in some ways wrapped up with those things. But like, again, how do you move forward? And you look at laws that like maybe are well-intended, like hey, you show up on Megan's list and now you can't live anywhere near a school, even if like your child abuse happened when you were 17 with a 16-year-old, you got that marked for good. So how do you go forward from that? I don't know. I can tell you, like, I share that suspicion. and so like, what's meaningful? And, you know, like the story to me is so hard. I'm like, Jesus, just let the guy leave. Like, let him have a good, fresh start. And he's like, nope, you get to live here. And everybody's going to be like, I've seen you naked before. You used to run around like naked, like foaming at the mouth. Like, how do you get that image out of your head? That's tough. I kind of wish Jesus had been like, you're right. Come on, let's put you somewhere new. You can get a fresh start, you know? I don't know if you also had any reaction to the idea, like the people in the town, they're not like, hey, thank God you're the deliverer. They're like, Jesus, go away. Like, we're scared of you because you have like driven this out. Like, we don't know what to do with this guy.
Well, do I remember correctly that Jenny preached on this story and talked about that this was somewhere in the Gentiles where they did eat pigs? So the swineherd basically lost his livelihood and all his assets, and I could see not feeling very friendly after that.
Yeah. No, it's really tough. And even if, like, I don't even, it's not like Jewish people think pigs are evil. They just don't eat them, right? So it's not like death to pigs. It's just like, we don't eat those. So like your regular Jewish reader would not celebrate the story. It would also be like, boy, like a lot of pigs died? That's weird.
Yeah, but did those people actually eat the pigs? So that
Probably.
was...
Yeah, probably so. I mean, nobody kept pigs as pets. Let's just be honest. I mean, still the number of people who keep pot-bellied pigs as pets in their home, really, really small. And so this is not a story of loss of pets. This is definitely loss of like substantial goods. And I don't know if we're meant to read the story, forgive me for saying this, literally or symbolically, because literally it's a tough story for me. You know, like there's the death of animals, which I find to be really, really tough, who are like essentially innocent, right? They didn't ask to be born pigs. They might have preferred to be born clean animals, you know, but like they're made and God says they're good, right? So that's a tough one. But if I read it as a type, it's a little easier for me, right? That these are unclean things and there's a legion and, you know, the Roman Empire is going to drown in its own chaos. It's a little easier for me. Doesn't mean I do away with the uncomfortable stuff. I just, there's probably more than one way a pig can fly when you read the story.
This is probably totally not related, but there recently, like the first pig heart transplant was just successful, right? And I was talking about this with some friends, and we were kind of going down this thought thing, you know, like, I don't know, just going all the way. Like, so one of the big issues with transplants in general is that there's not enough organs, right? And so that's why this potentially could be really beneficial. But then it gets into this question of like, okay, so we now raise pigs for their hearts, you know, and then, but then we were like, well, maybe it would make like most people who would want a pig heart would probably want like an organically, you know, free range pig. And so then it would make the pig farmers be like, oh, I can make more money if I treat the pigs better, you know? So like maybe, and it's totally not related, but sort of in this idea of, you know, yeah, I don't know, not related.
No, I think it is related, Julia, in the sense, right, that like, I don't even think ancient people were like blithe to animal cruelty, you know, and if we're like, oh yeah, that's just because pigs are unclean animals, that's what they get. I that's just a tough story. I mean, it's a tough read of the story for me. And I do think it brings up interest. I mean, if you choose to spin off, this is what I love about about reading scripture in a group is like, the answer is why not? You know, like it's something that's tangential to the story means it still touches the story.
Mike, didn't we go there when we went to Jordan, and we were at that Roman city that had been Greek, and you could look out and see the Sea of Galilee?
Yeah, when we went up toward the Golan Heights,
Mhm.
right, which is kind of where this would have been. And we didn't go all the way into the Golan, but you're thinking about the east side of the Galilee, or also called the Sea of Tiberias, right? In that region, Tiberias, or Gennesaret. That's what you're talking about. Yeah.
So this would have been a little village down the slope from that city.
Yeah, and I think I remember, because we did go to that ruined city there, Rhonda, that there sure was like a cliff view. And I remember Hisham saying like, this is maybe where that story happened. Yeah.
Mhm.
It's beautiful, by the way. The Galilee is
Yeah.
really pretty. The rest of the country is like San Diego, like a desert. And the Galilee is like Ireland. It's like green. And I mean, really, it's lovely. Were there other bits from these chapters?
I'm still stuck on reconciliation. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts, but it is such a hard thing to think about. I mean, like, with the prison situation, I don't know, how do you like, I know this is not a question that's going to get answered here, but I'm just really curious about how other people feel about that. Like, how do you create space for meaningful reconciliation? You know, I don't know.
Yeah, and we keep talking about it, Julia, because how different forgiveness is from reconciliation, and how for reconciliation to work, both people have to want it at the same time. And even then it's a crapshoot, right? Because it's like depends on like what variables we tie reconciliation to. Like a lot of times it's like, I'll be reconciled to you when you blank. And the other person wants it, and they might do parts A and B, but they refuse C. Right. So then like, how do you do that? And I think like this one's tough, like thinking about prison sentence, that's a cultural, social one, right? That's not like an individual buy-in. That takes like a whole group of people. Whereas like, I have trouble doing it with like individual relatives. I think forgiveness is hard enough as it is anyway. Like forgiveness is like, that's the lower hanging fruit, and that feels really far. You know, like, forgiveness seems really tough, because we've talked about this, that forgiveness is really like the gift you give yourself. It's not something you proclaim to somebody else, or like forgiveness is like giving up all hope of having had a different past. I'm really slow to give that hope up. I often wish for a different past in which you did not hurt me. you know, like, so when that's on the table, I don't even know.
Yeah, like it doesn't really seem possible. You know what I mean? I don't know, but I guess then you think about like the book of Revelation, and eventually it will be. I don't know, but you want it to be like, how do you live it out now? How do you live out, like, how do you make, these are really big questions, but like, how do you make meaningful movement towards forgiveness and reconciliation, like on a personal level, but like on a greater level when it's like, I don't know. Like, I don't know. It's hard. I don't have an answer.
It is hard. And I think sometimes we even think about it too narrowly, like we think about it interpersonally. I mean, look, I'm the only guy on the screen, and this might be a man thing to say, but like, how do you forgive your body after you've had a child for changing irretrievably? Like, that's tough. Like my spouse has a disconnected muscle in one of her ribs after giving birth. And of course the doctors wouldn't listen to her. They're like, oh, that's because, you know, you're just recovering, you know, like they didn't. That sounds funny. It's not like she needs to forgive another person, but you know, like your body has changed irretrievably. almost every woman I talk to says this, right, after pregnancy. And like, how do you accept that? You probably already know the answer to that. I don't.
That acceptance is a big thing. This, to me, this goes back to the Buddhist discussion we had earlier.
Yeah.
Acceptance of what is. Maybe it's not so much whether it's good or bad. It just is, and our attitude toward it is what makes it good or bad for us. So being willing to let go of anger doesn't mean that the love's going to come, that we're going to feel close to someone again when we're trying to reconcile. We've just worked through it enough that we're not as angry. Maybe we think of it in terms of progress. I'm not foaming at the mouth like I used to be when I think of that person.
Yeah.
I'm just acknowledging I don't like that person very much, and accepting that that's where I am right now, so that maybe next month or next year I can have more of a less dislike, and then later on maybe I'll have just acceptance of almost a nothing. It's almost a numbness of an absence of emotion toward that person. It's such a long process. That forgiveness is such a long process. And if we can acknowledge that we've made a little bit of progress and accepting where we are, and it's okay that we're still a little bit angry, at least we're not furious the way we used to be. I don't know if any of this is making any sense, but like Julia said, it's very difficult. Reconciliation is very difficult, and we tend to think of it in a dichotomous way. I either forgive or I love. No, it's a continuum for me.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you saying that, Darlene. And I think, I think we've been working at this. It's like super interest to a number of us on the screen. I know, because we spent like last Lent trying to work around these ideas. And many of us have done quite a bit of reading, and there's still something a little bit elusive about this, right? I mean, sometimes it's helpful when you hear somebody like Elie Wiesel say, hey, the opposite of love isn't hatred, it's indifference. And the opposite of good isn't evil, it's indifference. Like, okay, so like if I hate you, it doesn't mean I don't love you. In fact, probably like anger comes from a sense of like disappointment or disconnection. So maybe anger is not bad. It's like a pain signal that something in our joint body together needs attention. And then, like in the words of the Buddhist guy, like pain's natural. It's the suffering that we'd like to deal with.
And the suffering comes from our attitude toward the pain.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that we work with, like Julia would know, when we work with patients, people who are in chronic pain, it's shifting the thinking about the pain that helps modify it somewhat. It doesn't take it away, but it lessens it enough that it's manageable and you can live with that chronic pain. And again, it's a long process, and there are degrees of success, and we can redefine what success is.
Yeah. That probably seems really important. And I'm just thinking, even because we've got a physician on the screen too, like thinking about, again, how difficult that can be at your own level. So like, I'm going to say something really dumb, but because it's my own story, I feel like I can say it, like I am a high endurance athlete, and I eat a plant-based diet, and I have coronary heart disease. Like, the unfairness of that is really difficult. It's really difficult. Like
you're doing everything right, and this still happens.
My body is betraying me, or foods that are supposed to be good are poisonous. Like, I know that's an extreme position, but there's some truth in that, or at least in that feeling. So like, how do I forgive my body for killing me? That's really hard. How I know that sounds extreme, but like, I think, again, like, it's hard enough to do it with our own embodiment. And we don't even recognize that issue. So like, it's infinitely harder with somebody else and their embodiment. And there's all this like cultural business. I mean, if you as a lady have a baby and your body changes, that's one thing. But then there's all this cultural baggage that says, now you're ugly. And you can say, I don't accept that. Like, I refuse to be dominated by that, but it's going to chase you. Everywhere you look at media, like, that's going to chase you. And I do think it's harder for women, right? Because how do you win than it is for men? But it's some of us men, that's hard for us too, and what does reconciliation look like?
Darlene, you said something about like getting to a place of like acceptance or numbness, acceptance, or tell me more about that.
I don't like the word numbness, but
Yeah.
But less feeling. Excuse me, go ahead.
No, I was just curious about that. Like less feeling, because then like what Mike, you said about anger, love, anger, indifference, like how does that all, I don't know, those thoughts, how do those work together, or do they? Do you know what I'm being too cryptic. I don't know if I'm asking a question. Just making statements. Does that make sense what I'm asking, or no?
I think it makes sense in that the concept is hard. It's a hard concept. I think it goes along with, I think maybe if I give a personal example, there was a time long ago that there was a major betrayal in a relationship, major betrayal. And I was so angry, and because I was so hurt. And I didn't want to give up that anger, because that anger was a protection for me. And forgiveness was nowhere in the picture. I just couldn't. But then I realized I've got to do it for me, not for that person, because the anger is eating me up inside. It's a barrier between me and other people. It's a barrier between me and my God. There was so much anger that I couldn't feel God's love. So what I worked on doing was beginning to pray, God, help me to be willing to let go of my anger. I didn't pray to take away my anger, but just help me to be willing to let go of some of it. And I prayed it over and over and over. And then just all of a sudden one Sunday morning, I was praying that and I was tearful. And there was just this little lessening, a little bit of softening in my heart. It was not forgiveness, but it was movement toward being willing. And so no longer was it either or, it was movement toward. And eventually I got pretty far with it. There is still some protectiveness in me. There's still some awareness that that ain't gonna happen to me anymore. But I think that's healthy. We can let go of the intense anger, but keep an awareness that is a potential. But that too has got to be moderated, because it could interfere with a current relationship or a future relationship. So it's degrees, it's tiny little degrees. And if I can encourage myself to be okay with where I am right now, that I've made progress, if I can remind myself that I'm doing better than I did back then, then that leaves it open for me to continue to grow and to continue to get better. I don't know that that's helpful, Julia, but that's kind of where I am personally with it.
No, I think that's very helpful. I think it's really helpful to think of it as a continuum versus
Yes.
an all or nothing,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, my sister-in-law, when her kids say like, "Mom, I'm terrible at drawing," she says, "Well, you're not as good as you'd like to be yet."
Yeah.
So there's like the not yet, but if this is important to you, you can choose to be. And that seems kind of hopeful. I honestly think that like one of the gifts of sacramentality is like we have some, like, for lack of a better word, magic associated around them. And like, that's probably why they work sometimes, like having somebody anoint you with oil and lay hands on your head, or saying like, "Oh, I'm going to remember my baptism," or going like literally to the Jordan River and being immersed in the Jordan again, because like that's a core story for us. The frame is set, I think, for that to do some really cool work, sometimes even like deeper than we know. I don't know that they always like are effectual in like giving me what I want, but I do feel like they're really cool opportunities to help embody that stuff. Anything
Sorry
else?
about my back.
Oh yeah, you're good. No, the Savasana pose is a legitimate one, right? It's my favorite yoga pose. Lay down and go to sleep. I love that one.
So does the girl with the hemorrhaging, does that also relate to the uncleanliness and her transition?
I think so, right? I mean, and that's a weird thing when you think about like just like fundamental human existence is unclean.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we just need to say that. and if we could say that, then maybe it wouldn't be, because it's fundamental. It's like when it's a challenge. That's a really tough story, isn't it? Like it's so weird. And like, man, when I read Luke, I'm like, man, you've got some real insight into fundamental misogyny. Like, what's this lady supposed to do?
I think too, like it's when I read it, I don't know, maybe you were talking about it in one of your chapters too, where you like think, oh, we're better than that now or something. But I'm like, oh, we're not really that much better at that now, like maybe it's not that specific issue, but maybe it still is, and in a lot of places, and just other, like neurodiversity and like lots of different things where we just are not accepting or open to that. I think it's like very fear driven, which probably is the same thing with like prisoners, right? And it feels very all sort of fear based. Like so much of that comes from just unknown fear.
Yeah, that seems right. I'm reading this book. I just started it today called Women and Other Monsters. And it's really interesting. The book talks about these Greek myths and like how they represent culturally the way women are treated. And like, you can try to conform to beauty standards, or you can be a monster. And so the book is sort of like reclaiming the role of monsters for women. Like, this is sort of interesting to sort of think through. And I can't help, mainly because I listened to it this morning some, but like also like tying that to this hemorrhaging woman story, right? Because she's a monster. And yet like she shows like a male virtue of courage. And it's interesting, like as a kid, I grew up like, oh, it's because she has so much faith. That's why she touches Jesus. And I'm reading that, I'm like, this lady's desperate. And maybe that's faith, is desperation. I don't know, but like if you told her to like hook electrodes to herself, she probably would, right? She would probably try anything to be like a person again. And it's just so interesting how we put a premium on like, oh no, that's not faith. No, faith is like you trust it's going to work, instead of like you're just desperate. Maybe that's like a cool evangelical strategy, like come to God in desperation or try it. Probably can't hurt you anymore. You know, like, I don't know. It's sort of interesting to think through.
I like how you related the her not being able to touch anyone, or no one being able to touch her, to the, is it Jairus's daughter?
Yeah.
That, yeah, maybe she's not dead. No one wants to touch her.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny. We always assume she's dead because people say she is, but the story doesn't say she's dead. And Jesus says she's not dead, she's sleeping. That could have been literally true.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So
It's like, sorry.
So one thing I found odd at the end of that story of Jairus and his daughter is that Jesus tells him not to tell people. Whereas in the other stories, he said, go and share this story. And so why is that one is this reverse psychology? Is this, what was going on there?
So what most scholars will tell you is Mark comes first, and Matthew and Luke both have Mark in their hand, and then they have some other stories, right? Or a version of Mark called Q, which stands for the source, right? And it stands for Quelle in German, which means like a well. So there's this theme that happens in Mark, like every Bible scholar will tell you this, it's called like the gospel secret, because Jesus is always telling people who figure out who he is, don't tell anybody. And like, it's an enigma, like why wouldn't you want people to know? And like I guess the interpretation I'm most convinced by is because people will get it wrong. And it's sort of like, if I have to explain a joke to you, it's not funny. And so like it only really works when it's a firsthand experience instead of a second or third hand experience. And like the disciples are the ones who get it the wrong guessed, if you don't mind me saying. The ones who seem to like get it are sick people and ugly people and women and foreigners. Like they figure it out, but all of the regular people who should know cannot seem to get it right. And maybe it's because, oh, look, Jesus did a miracle. Let's make him king by force. It's like they're going to hear this thing and they're going to put it into their own understanding, which is called assimilation, instead of accommodating. Yeah, as I showed it last week, right? Like we like to assimilate the gospel left and right. We like to use it to prop up our worldview, right? You can read how people use the Bible to justify homophobia and slavery and misogyny, and you can read it that way. Of course you can. But I would suggest that's not really a holy read of it. So I think part of it is like, look, like Jesus is trying to like avoid people getting the wrong impression. I don't know.
And yet these stories circulated for decades and then got written down.
And what's really weird, if you don't mind me saying, Antha, is like the hubris we have of like, well, those dumb disciples, like we know better, but like they knew him. Like, and we haven't seen the guy. Like, why do we think we would get him right? Which kind of makes me think like if like the best way to read the Gospels is look to be offended. And if you didn't get offended, you didn't read it right. Because the people who knew him were constantly offended.
So all the people that understood Jesus, right, were all of the like unwell people or foreigners that were like in a place of desperation, perhaps, and had ears to hear or eyes to see.
People on the margins of society.
Yeah.
Right. And I just wonder like how we think about that today, and like how we could, I think I have a tendency to perceive myself not as one of those people, you know, like not as somebody on the margin. I mean, I'm not, right? Like if I'm looking at it societally, I'm not really on the margin, but like in what ways are we those people, you know? Does that make sense what I'm saying? And like, how can, I think when we acknowledge that part of ourselves, then we can have eyes to see or ears to hear, you know? But I think it's hard. I think I don't see myself as that person. Anyway.
I mean, I think this is what I love about the Godly Play curriculum, is it always asks, like, where are you in the story? And a lot of times, if I'm really honest, I'm in a lot of different places in the story at the same time. Like I'm one of the disciples saying, like, Jesus, duh, there's like a lot of people around. Of course, somebody touched you. Like, just let's keep going, right? And sometimes, like, I'm pretty clearly the hemorrhaging lady, and I just can't seem to like get the bleeding to stop. And I do think that we read that book, Mujerista Theology, where the lady talks about like, hey, people who like enjoy the benefits and the privileges can't reimagine the system because they don't need to. Like the people who are being crushed by the system are the ones who have insight into like how it might change. But I don't know that it's always an either or, because I'm really clear, of course, like economic privilege is important, but I know lots of people who are economically privileged that are like living in hell, because this is not just like a cash economy, you know. And we can say like, well, your pain's worse than mine. That's never helpful. I mean, pain hurts. You know, like the fact that somebody else might be hurting worse, I mean, I guess that's good to keep in mind. Like, that's not going to make me not hurt anymore. Like, I don't need to talk myself out of hurting. Like, pain hurts. So I don't know. It's sort of like, you know, like there's even this tension, and like, well, how can you be a minister in like the church in River Oaks? Because those people have everything. Well, I mean, they have some things, but I'm pretty sure there's people in River Oaks who have depression and are struggling with like chemical addiction and workaholism and perfectionism. Like and I don't want to say, oh, look, everybody's just got pain, but everybody does have pain. I got this really nice article from Jim. He said, you know, a lot of times when we think about the Exodus story, we're like, oh, we're the people of Israel, and maybe we're the pharaohs. But it's very possible that we find ourselves in both roles. I still think the touch thing is important. And like, I don't want to overscore like anointing with oil, but it's like one of those ways where you're sanctioned with touch, which like validates your embodiment, which is usually the thing we struggle with the most. Like, my feelings are out of my control and I don't know what to do. And then you've got somebody who's like, in some ways, like being touched is being seen. It's rife for abuse. We all know that, but it's also sort of like, with permission, a risk worth taking. You know what I mean? Like, as long as we can consent as best as we can, you know, there's just, when people say I hear you, okay, but then like when you're touched, like you're physically connected with somebody at your most fundamental embodied level.
Several weeks ago during the food distribution, that's so frantic, so fast-paced, and yet there was one woman who I had taken the data from, and she got very, very upset, very agitated, and told me this very complex story quickly. And it was time for her to move on in the line of cars. And I just asked, could I touch you? And I just touched her on the arm, the forearm. And I don't know that I said anything. I may have said something, but it was the touch. And as I touched her arm, she calmed down and could focus on driving. It was a beautiful opportunity, example of an opportunity to minister, to calm, to be present with someone who needed the human touch. Mm. She, as I was listening to her, that was helpful. But what was most helpful was that calming presence of human touch.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's the story of St. Francis, right? He converted when he touched an untouchable.
Yes, I'd forgotten that.
And I'm not sure that the untouchable person had a conversion moment. That's the interesting thing. Francis converted.
Yeah. Yeah. And there was almost a visceral response from me too. It was a connection.
Yeah.
And it was not only a connection to her, but for me, it was a connection to the divine between the two of us.
I think this actually is a great story, Darlene, that talks a little bit about one of those questions about reconciliation. And I know I've mentioned it before, but like according to the research I've read, if you're having trouble with somebody, one of the best things you can do is share contact with them for a sustained moment, right? Whether that's like, I don't think I like gay people, then you like consensually, like you hold hands and that does something in your brain.
Yes, yes. I used to do that with my son when he was little, and he was emotionally disturbed and just raging, just out of control. And nothing I've said would work.
Yeah.
And so I would just kneel down and open my arms and put my arms around him, not in a hold, but in an embrace.
Yeah.
And just touched him and held him. And he could calm down. He could self-regulate then with my help. But it was that human touch. And the longer I held him, the calmer he got.
Thing I have not done in a heated debate. Wow, this is getting kind of heated. Could I hold your hand for just like a minute?
Yeah.
But why, like, it's funny. I don't know why I haven't done that, because like, I know the research that says like that would be beneficial, but somehow it feels really awkward, This research also extends to spouses, right? And for what it's worth, like, oh, I hug my spouse, but it takes a 1 minute hug, which I rarely give the 1 minute hug. Usually it's like the 5-second hug, and that one feels like longer, but the 1 minute hug is like where you optimize the release of oxytocin in your brain. And like hand holding like this is good, but the more surface area, the better, right? So like, I don't know, there's something to that. I don't know why I don't ask for it, but I probably should. Could, not should. I probably could, and it could be helpful. Well, I'm grateful for your time. And grateful for you reading this book. And when we get tired of it, we can quit. But I think for now, let's just pretend like we're going to read the next 5 chapters for next week. That's 30 through 34. And I'll see you then, if not before. Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate you.
Thank you.